Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the AIIM Growth Partners podcast, the podcast where we dive into the minds of some of the most interesting and inspiring leaders from across the technology landscape and unpack the strategies underpinning their success. My name is David Loader and I'm your host. Today, I'm joined by David Zeff, the founder of Whistle, a global sales development agency which has served over 300 businesses globally. In today's episode, we'll be diving into David's story and that of Whistle, uncovering the trends, pivots, and pitfalls that have invariably led to the success they enjoy today. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
Now, before we get kind of stuck into the juicy stuff, could we begin by giving the listeners a bit of context and background on yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I today live in Israel with my wife and 3 kids. Prior to that, I was born in South Africa, grew up in Australia. So I've done a bit of a world tour. And my background prior to creating Whistle was I've always been interested in business. I got into SaaS by building a business app for personal trainers. So I was a personal trainer while I was studying at university. I was studying business at university and noticed that none of my friends really had a lot of business sense. My trainer friends, that is. And so I built a bookings and collections and payments app with a friend. And then from there, I sort of got hooked into the world of SaaS. And that's led me into the journey that I am today. So I spent just over a decade in SaaS, and I've been very lucky to be part of 3 exits, one being with that company and then with 2 others here in Israel. And my plan was always to be a SaaS founder. An opportunity called after the 3rd exit, some VCs reached out to help their portfolio, and they all needed the same thing, which is support with go-to-market, business development, sales development. I started by consulting, but very quickly, I asked them, who's actually doing the outreach? Sales development isn't really something that can be theorized. At some point, someone has to pick up the world's heaviest object, which is the telephone, and have a conversation. And so I suggested that I build a team when all of those founders told me that, actually, no one's doing any of those calls. That's fast forwarding to today. We're now coming to our 6th year as a business. We're a 100% remote first company. We started at the beginning of COVID. So that created a lot of cultural elements in our business that have become foundational today. We are about 130 people. We're coming closer even now to about 350 companies that we've worked with. We cover every time zone. And the majority of the clients that we work with are B2B tech companies that are trying to break into USA, UK, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Australia. Those are the main markets. Yeah, when I kind of gloss over it like that, it just feels like a very quick, helicopter ride. But I feel like it's been a big journey over the last, let's say, 6 years as CEO of Whistle, but then I guess the decade prior in SaaS.
Well, I look forward to diving in, zooming in a little bit more into that story, but I think that's a really good kind of frame and context, for the listeners who aren't already familiar with you and your work. So stripping back to what you said, you always wanted to be a SaaS founder. How intentional, out curiosity, was the move back to Israel then? Because I think we see from cybersecurity, but tech generally, the ecosystem in Israel is fantastic. So was that always an intentional move from that perspective?
So the original reason for moving here was actually personal. I met my wife, so that kind of sealed the deal. But I was amazed when I came to see the career opportunities. So I just sold my equity in my Aussie company. Australia at the time, it's got better, but at the time it was an incredibly hard country to build a SaaS company in because the culture is super risk averse. It still is risk averse, but they have a bit more of maturity around VCs, and they've had some great successes, in the last 11, 12 years with companies like Canva, etc. But just to give you an example, like in Australia, as a founder trying to raise money for an early stage tech company, you're dealing with this crazy question where a VC will ask you, like a VC who's supposed to take a ton of risk, will ask you things like, how proven is your product? How much profitability? How much growth do you have? Then at the same time, they expect to find like the next biggest risk taker. It's a very hard market. So I was amazed when I came to Israel to see firstly just the cultural shift. Israel is sort of like, I saw the other day there's a startup that raised tens of millions of dollars and they don't even have a product yet. Um, and it's just like two founders with obviously a great idea and probably a great track record, but still, like that kind of thing conceptually just doesn't enter the lexicon in Australia. So I was amazed to see it. And, Israel's second to Silicon Valley for tech. And it's a very small country, right? Considering it's 10 million people total, only of which about 500,000 actually work in SaaS. So that creates like a very, very intensely focused network. And then if you look at like the last year, there was $15 billion of exit money paid out to employees, not including like the big exits like Wiz, etc. So that's a crazy, it's not even, I was going to say a bubble, but it's not really a bubble. It's like this cauldron. So stepping into that as a new immigrant was like very eye-opening for someone like me. And I'm naturally entrepreneurial. And I just, honestly, I felt like I've embraced that with two hands since I got off. I was going to say got off the boat, but it really was off the plane. Got off the plane here. From day one, I just like jumped onto that. I think for some people that, like me, that culture is amazing. It's inspiring. It's really fun. For others, it also comes with a lot of disruption and risk, and also coming from a country like Australia, I would imagine the UK as well, where things are a bit more linear. I would imagine that could be a big culture shock. But for me, I've loved it.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. One of the things you kind of tapped into there, I won't take us down a kind of rabbit hole there too much because we can probably do an entire podcast episode on it. But I think the contrast between seeing kind of UK VCs and that of kind of the US and Israel, it's amazing the sort of difference there where you see kind of UK VCs are wanting established kind of commercial traction. They're wanting however many clients, and these businesses are applying for sort of seed money, but yet they need to have these enterprise. Yeah, or these sort of Fortune 100, Fortune
Yeah.
500 customers. Whereas I've had, several kind of Israeli founders on the podcast specifically talking about their cybersecurity businesses, which actually they might not have paying customers, but they have enough kind of design partners or whatever else that represent, Fortune 100 potential clients, and that's enough to raise tens of millions. So it's really interesting, but I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but probably having that experience then in Australia, your eyes kind of lit up when you went to Israel and you really kind of seized the opportunity there because it was in direct contrast to what you're used to in Australia.
Yeah, correct. I mean, we met, for my first business, we met with all the main VCs in at least, those that had an office in Sydney. And the questions they ask compared to what an early stage investor would ask in Israel are completely different. Australia, they're very metrics focused. They want to see product adoption rates. They want to see revenue, things that don't exist when you're at a very early stage. And they sort of, at least at the time, maybe things are different. I personally haven't seen that. And we work with a lot of Aussie tech companies, but let's just imagine things have improved in some respect. But what I felt was they ask questions that aren't possible for an early stage founder to answer, which it creates its own, there's pros and cons to that too. What happens is if an Aussie company does make it, they're fantastic companies, right? You get these brilliant companies. But in order for them to make it, they have to have so many hoops that they've jumped through. Whereas the risk tolerance in Israel is extremely high. So, Israeli society has nothing against a person starting a business, trying for whatever 6, 12 months, crashing out and then starting a new one. That doesn't mark your record in a negative way. It's actually seen as like a positive thing because the assumption is, well, if he keeps trying, it's going to crack at some point, right? And that actually is what happens. I mean, that is entrepreneurship, by the way. We just don't report it. Whereas Australian culture, the fear, if you took the average Australian entrepreneur and you told them, hey, like the journey is probably that you're going to like go bankrupt in a few companies first, they probably wouldn't take that jump because there's a lot of stigma attached. Oh, you see, you should have just taken that job at like, EY or PwC and just followed the tracking, stable. And so, yeah, I think that's a massive, massive shift. And I think that also explains why tech booms here and booms in the US and why it's one of the reasons, but why it's so much harder for companies in countries like the UK, Australia, Europe, which are a lot more risk averse, and then create all these legislations and frameworks that, kind of contain that even further. I think it makes it much more difficult for them to succeed. So I often feel like when I talk to a successful founder in those countries, they're succeeding in spite of the environment that they're in, not because of. And I know every country likes to, showcase its wins, but not all of those countries have helped those wins happen, if we're being honest.
So moving on then to the business. So you said in the early stages you were kind of contacted by VCs, all kind of come to you with the same problem, which was go-to-market strategy and actually kind of implementing that. And talk me through that kind of turning point, which then led to you building Whistle and those first kind of couple of years.
Yeah, so I think this is a personal preference thing. I could have gone down the route of becoming a consultant, and maybe it would have been easier, right? Than building a company and having, building a big team of, 130 people and managing them and dealing with all that. But I always have had like sort of like a chip on my shoulder of something to prove. And I felt that by just consulting and giving advice, I'm not saying that giving good advice is a bad thing. Absolutely, it's fantastic. But just doing that, personally, I didn't feel like I could ship something that was measurable. And so, like on a personal level, what appealed to me was to say, wait a second, like I want to prove to you that not only can I give you the strategy, but we can execute and I can make you money. Um, Whistle, as of last quarter, returned $14 in closed won revenue for every dollar that was spent with us by our clients on average. And that's a pretty great stat. Like I often tell my team, like if I had that machine in my house, I would literally be putting that dollar in and yanking the handle of the slot machine all day long because that's an insane return. And that to me is like, on a personal level, that to me is really important because I feel like I can hold myself and my team accountable to our clients. So that was already sort of the seed for that transition was already there. Um, and then, one of the first people in our company outside of myself was my brother. And I brought him on. He'd also built, he'd been part of the SDR teams and managed SDR teams. And I had also built and managed sales teams and SDR teams in two of the exits. And so we operationalized from there. And the hardest thing I would say in terms of the journey is not when you had one client and not when you have 50 clients. It's when you have like 3 clients or 5 clients, because if like 2 or 3 of them are unhappy, that's like 60% of your customers, right? And that can happen. That statistically could happen on the same day. So you could start on Monday and 2 of your clients are complaining. You've only got 3, or they're underperforming and you only got 3. And I feel like I worked way harder in the beginning with way more stress than I do today. Now that even though we're bigger and we're dealing with much more complex situations, and those first few years are very scrappy, very, very scrappy. It's very hard to put yourself out there. And that is what you have to do when you're building a business. There is no, unless maybe if you're B2C and you've figured out some way of like finding all your customers with no touch. And I do envy those guys sometimes, but in the B2B world, at least, especially as a services business, I mean, you're riding on your reputation. You have to build that reputation. You have to build a lot of trust and networks. You have to prove it. And then all of those initial clients came via referral and word of mouth. And that is still the main source of our leads today, which is from happy customers or partners that have worked with us that refer business to us in networks that we're part of. Those are still like the 3 main sources of leads today with everything else that we're doing. So, yeah, those first few years were pretty tough. And it was also a very tough time to start a business. So one, COVID hit, and in the beginning, we all thought we were all going to die and the world's going to fall apart. Which was, that was like the first 6 months or even first year, right? And and also for me personally, I have 3 kids. My second child was just born when we started, and so it was like a very high risk time of life to start a business in it, and I'm happy we did. Like I think for me, once we had our 3rd client on board, I remember calling my dad and just saying, like, Dad, like, do I have a business here? Like, I've got 3 clients. And he's like, yeah, if you've got 3 clients, you've got a company, like, get going. And I remember distinctly having this conversation with my wife where I said to her, there's got to be 10 companies in the world that would hire us. And like with 10 companies, I don't have to like even look for a job. Like I can earn better than I was earning as an employee. And like, that's fine. Just have 10 customers. Um, so it requires a lot of self-belief, and it requires a lot of guts and fortitude and hours of work. And fortunately or unfortunately for me, it was a lot of work and a lot of stress. Maybe someone else has figured out how to do it with no work and no stress. But yeah, those first few years were very formative, I think, and it helped me. I often appreciate a lot more about where we're at today as a result of knowing what we had to get here. Especially as like a bootstrapped company as well, that it's been self-funded from day one.
And how important, just with that final thing there, how important was it being kind of bootstrapped? What's the rationale behind, staying bootstrapped?
So transparently, we've been offered a few times over the last few years to be either invested in or even acquired. Specifically, private equity comes around very often. Um, I think for me, so there's two parts. One part is that as a largely services business, the the investment rationale doesn't work out. I actually knew of another company in our space that raised money through a VC, and it's a little bit like strapping a rocket onto the back of like a car. They don't really work well together, and you land up making decisions that might look really good for the investor, but are really not in the interest of your customer or in the interest of building a long-term sustainable business. So I saw that happen actually with this other agency. Like they blew up as you would expect. Like they grew really fast for 18 months and they blew up. And if you look in the space that we operate, it's actually very easy for a company to start in our space and get to like 1 million ARR in year one. The real test is if that company still exists in 18 months, and most don't. So I see them pop up all the time, a new up and comer, and I wish them the very best of luck. And they look like they're doing great at the beginning. Everyone looks like they're doing great at the beginning. The question is if you're still here after 2 years. So for me, that was one part of it. The other part of it is there's a lifestyle element here. I worked in those companies. I worked in invested, VC funded, fast growing tech companies. There is a lot of pressure to get to a certain number, and that you know I admire the people who've managed to figure out how to deal with that in a way that doesn't basically tear their personal lives apart, but I haven't seen too many examples. And if I look at like the founders of these businesses, many of which I either worked for or I just know on a personal level, they've had to make very, very insane sacrifices that today are socially acceptable, but I personally didn't want to bring into my life. So when I looked at like what I was trying to build, at the starting point, the seed behind what I was trying to build is a way for me to provide for my family in the context of also being able, as a father with the young kids, being able to actually have a relationship with my kids and with my wife, and also be able to have like my health and my friends and my network, etc. I'm a very, very ambitious person, but the financial goals that I have for myself, that we have for a business, are also sort of counterbalanced by the lifestyle goals. And as a company, there's always this juggling act between what does your team need? What do your customers need? Right. And then sort of like, where do you want to be? And to kind of align all of those requires a lot of focus and finesse. And at least from my perspective, having an investor in the room at an early stage, unless you already know those, you've got those three rings perfectly aligned, it can break everything. There are some types of businesses that have no choice, right? If you're doing hardware or whatever, you don't have a choice. You have to have somebody from day one. But in our kind of business, we did. And I think the more that time goes on, the more thankful I am for it. And every time when we've had like a serious investor come by, um, I've really struggled to understand what value they're going to bring into the equation that we couldn't get ourselves within a year or 2 years. And I think that having patience is a very overlooked quality in a founder and in a business leader, because today we all want to hear those stories of like, so and so built the company. 6 months later, they sold it. For me, the ultimate fantasy story is Base 44. I don't know if you've heard about them or if you know about the lovable competitor. Started his company. He got to, I think, 4 million ARR in the first 6 months. Sold it to Wix for $80 million. 6 people company. I think most of it is in cash, and he's doing his thing. It's pretty cool. No investors. So we hear a lot of those stories, and that's like amazing. But realistically, like if you want to build something real and long term, you have to have a lot of patience. And I think that taking on investors early, or even today, would derail it completely.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one because I think sometimes people just think about the money and they think about the size and the scale, and a lot of those are kind of vanity or ego metrics, aren't they? Back to something you said earlier as well, you said competitors come along, spin up a business and actually get some success, 1 million ARR within a year or so. Why do you think so many of them do fail within 18 months, 2 years?
So when you have a very large TAM, right, total addressable market, and a product that solves a real need, it's very easy to grow as a company. It's easier. Now, nothing's easy, but it's easier, right, than if the others were reversed. So as far as demand, let's say tomorrow you want to start a company like mine, right? A business development company. Does every company in the world need sales development, business development? Okay, that's fine. So you'll get a lot of demand. But what a lot of the business owners that I've seen fail with is systemization, being the right people, the right processes, the right principles that allow for a really strong foundation to be built. And if you don't have it, it's sort of like you're stacking cards and then the bottom one's wobbly. At some point, the stack's going to fall down pretty quick. So yeah, you might be able to stack it up, 5 cards up, and then boom, you're done. And that is what happens with a lot of these companies because they don't think of those things. Hypnotized by that revenue growth or that curve that we're all taught about in startup land, right? And I'm sure now today with just the AI coding tools, that explosion of that, it's just suddenly that it's even more possible, right? That you can spin out product now really quick. And but there's so many other parts to building a successful company than just demand and revenue and sales. You actually have to have a way to keep that and contain that, to build a team that can support that, to have a larger vision and a foundation so that your growth isn't up and down like a crazy roller coaster ride. Or I always joke with people that like in the beginning it was like a roller coaster, and now it's more like a train track, and that's cool. Like it's slowly, going up, but it's always going up versus these crazy highs and then crushing lows. And I think what reduced the curve for us between, the ups and the downs was number one, making sure we brought on the people that really aligned with our vision of who we want to be and where we want to be. And then especially over the last few years is like operationalizing all of that. And when I say the people, I don't just mean the internal team, I also mean the customers. In the first few years, you sort of feel like you can't say no to a lot of companies because it's like, oh my God, they have a pulse and they're willing to give me money. Like that is the criteria, for your first few customers. And at some point you realize like, oh, wait a second, that isn't always the greatest filtering criteria. Like having an unhappy customer is sometimes worse than not having a customer. And so if I look at like the last 2-3 years, one of the things that's massively changed is like who we take on. Being able to say to people like, and I literally had a call like this just before the Christmas break with the founder who was like, who I just told him straight out, like explained to me exactly why they're a bad fit for us. And he was just like so impressed. Even though they're not going to be a customer, he's like, listen, that was like the most honest conversation I've had. And I gave him ideas of what else he should do. And I think that is like really the key. So if I look at these companies that come on and burn really bright for a very short time, it's because of that. Yes, they have a huge problem that they're solving. They have a massive TAM. Tons of people experience this problem. And they can charge a lot of money as a result for it. What do they lack? Everything else, right? The structure, the foundation, the principles, the people. And that stuff is not interesting. It doesn't make I don't think I've ever read a startup article about that. I've only ever read articles about exits, fundraisers, crazy product launches. I've hardly ever read an article about, culture, team principles and how, this company, what they're doing that's different is very rare. And if you do read it, it's only in the context of here's how this company, scaled to this crazy result. And then there's like this little thing about, every once in a while you see those like posts about how Jeff Bezos does these meetings in Amazon that are like, this is the structure. I don't know if they're real or not, And I'm like, okay, sure. Yeah, sure. Where were those posts when he was building it? They weren't there, right? Um, yeah, that's my take. That's why I think these companies burn really bright and then burn out and fizzle out versus like the ones that can really endure, have those other pieces lined up.
Yeah, it's like an attribution bias, isn't it? I think I'm not sure if that's the right term, but it's so interesting where the less sexy sides of building kind of a startup, you often don't see that, and they might be the cornerstones, they might be the kind of the bedrock for why the business is that way. So talking about people and I guess kind of selection being the kind of the cornerstone for you in the business. Talk me through then the decision to operate this global model, both in terms of the employees you brought on, but also the clients, because presumably that would make it more difficult than maybe focusing initially just on Israel and expanding out. So talk to me around that.
Yeah, I think when COVID hit, I was just fortunate to be in a position where the third exit that I'd been a part of happened, and I sort of had this point in time to look at the environment that we were in. And I think what people don't really understand is it wasn't just about like a pandemic or whatever. It actually was a major world culture shift that happened. And a lot of things changed. One of the big things that changed, as an example, is the brand moved from the business to the individual. Every business moved from professional to personal. Um, and that changed the way we interact culturally, right? Like today, if you're in a sales call and someone's got a pet cat, that is not something you would find rude. That wouldn't kill a deal with somebody. In fact, today that might even be like, oh, I have cats as well, or whatever, right? Whereas 6 years ago, 7 years ago, that would be like, can you believe the guy's cat like walked across the screen? I remember I used to do Zoom calls with no camera, and now CEO would be like, please turn your cameras on in sales calls. And we'd be like, what? That's like, I'm not doing that. That's so weird. And today, that's like, 99% of the time that I'm working, it's just how we're working. So to get to the point though, like I realized there was a cultural shift, right? So, um, okay, if the way people are interacting are different, what other things can we change as a business? Do we have to have an office? No. That's going to allow me to find talent across the world. And to create an arbitrage as well, because what people are paid in different countries. For example, what you pay for an SDR in Israel is significantly higher than what you'd pay for an SDR in Cape Town, South Africa, which is where our teams are based. The quality as well is significantly different. An SDR, let's say an experienced SDR in most countries that have like a fast-growing tech environment, like USA, Israel, UK, Australia, the definition of experience is like 2 years. That'd be amazing. You can find a 2-year experienced SDR that isn't wanting to be an AE tomorrow. Like what a diamond in the rough. Our SDRs have at least 5 years of sales experience. So you're dealing with them very different quality and are happy to be there. The average SDR at Whistle has been with us for more than 2 years, and we're coming to 6-year company. We've got about 100 SDRs. So that allowed for that dynamic. I had this sort of idea of as well initially of like, wouldn't it be cool if we had customers around the world and look, this was kind of stupid, but at the beginning I was like, I'm like effectively earning money while I sleep, right? As a business owner. So there was that, there's a way to appeal to global companies. And the problem that I saw us solving for many customers is distribution, right? We can get you coverage around the world. Ease of use, plug in and play teams ready to go, trained, full tech stack, hardware, everything you need. And then because of the understanding that both myself and my brother Yona had, who's our COO, had with regards to the tech space, we knew what they needed. So we knew how to kind of combine both those worlds. We're both ex-South Africans, so we both knew the culture, and we knew how to kind of start, like, where to look and how to create this environment with those two systems connected. And that's basically what we do is, in a micro sense, we connect people. In a broader sense, we connect people through prospects and, our customers. Um, and I think that it started by being willing to challenge the status quo of how a business should look and operate. So about 2 years after we launched, I asked the team, like, should we set up some sort of like office? And everyone was like, no, 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 no. And so this has allowed us to like hire people from all over the world, that even countries that, I would never consider or hadn't even, thought of. So we have teams based out of the Philippines, we have teams based out of South Africa, Australia, Canada, the Balkans, and they service companies in all sorts of countries. Even like today, I noticed we've got a customer from Finland. So, it's just really, really cool. And I think that, to me, it was like, if we can embrace this now, it's just going to put us at a much, greater advantage than if we're going to think, hey, like we're just in Israel. With all of that being said, this is our local market. This is our home turf. And, ironically, um, one of the main goals that Yona and I both have individually and for the company is to really like dominate this local market. And and why I say it's ironic is that's going to be done through face-to-face networking and meeting. And so like, to me, this year is all about like, steak dinners and coffees basically, and trying to just get in front of as many people physically as possible, because that is how the ecosystem here works.
There's a fantastic woman I should probably connect you with based over in the Balkans, but she joined me on the podcast last year, and really interesting. She built the biggest recruitment company platform sold to Daily Mail. And on the podcast, she was talking about kind of the diaspora, or the brain drain of the diaspora kind of returning to the Balkan regions. And there weren't, the jobs necessarily there. And we were talking about kind of the pandemic. So a similar sort of thing at play, that you've got such such talented people, but the salaries, in those sort of regions are significantly less. So you mentioned people being kind of the cornerstone of the business. Talk to me about the kind of the three main kind of criteria you look for when you're kind of hiring.
So it's funny, like as time went on, I learned this lesson more than at the beginning. Like I can talk now like as if I always knew it, but I didn't always know it. Like I was like every other founder, let's make some money. And I learned lessons like well, maybe some people don't learn those lessons, but I learned those lessons by, failing. But I knew very early on that the first hire, other than Yona, was going to be needed to be a person that could bring people on. So our first hire was actually an HR recruiter that we brought on. She sort of doubled up as like an SDR and an HR. Well, I was an SDR as well for Whistle, right? Like that's how I started. I was making the calls, and so was Yona. I think that the three main criteria that we look for. The first one has got to be integrity. Especially in a business that's remote first, you have to be able to trust people that you're working with. And that extends even further than just the individuals that you're hiring. It also extends to customers, right? Like, yeah, everything in business is actually about trust. You can have whatever contracts you want, right? But if you don't trust that the other person is going to fulfill it, it's very expensive to prosecute that contract against, yes, we have these terms, but now I've got to pay lawyers thousands of dollars to enforce that I get paid or whatever. So I think that first element, that integrity, trust element, is really, really important. It's very hard to screen for that because, it's like those questions that you get before you get on an airplane where they're like, are you a terrorist? And it's like, no, right? So it's like, you're not going to ask somebody like, are you a cheating liar? They're going to tick yes, right? So I think you have to do a bit of a interpersonal test there. And for that, you have to have someone you trust, know how to, with very high EQ, know how to understand that. So that's, I think, number one. Number two is competence. They really have to know what they're doing. There are some roles that you can fake till you make it. There are some roles that you can start at okay in and then get really good in. But for us as a performance-based company, we're literally as good as like how we did last week. In fact, every day our clients are looking like, how many calls did you guys make? How many meetings did you book? How many emails were sent? What's our reply rate? Whatever, right? So we knew we had to have very, very, very high quality candidates. That is something that you can assess. And you can assess that in our world in a practical way. So we would have, like, if you apply to be an SDR at Whistle, you actually have to send us like a voice recording that you have to call. And we, as part of the interview process, we run mock calls, and now with AI, we can do all this cool stuff, which is like amazing. Um, so, you have to know what you're doing. And that's for every role. So yes, I've spoken a lot about SDRs, but also like finance people that we bring on now, for our internal or recruiters or marketing people, etc. I think that's the second most sort of important criteria. And the third um, is their actual what's the right word for it? I'm going to say culture, but it's not the right word. But there's a certain dynamic that you can't really create it, you can't force it in a company, but you can cultivate it. And when you start to bring on people that have a certain like type of culture, if they're anti-culture to what you're trying to create, it can break a lot of things and it can scare off the right people. So, like, ironically, how we started was we basically started by just hiring family and friends, and then friends and family of those people. And if you look at Whistle today, we still basically are like that. Like, I often joke that we have a mafia hiring policy. So it's like you're either a parent of, sibling of, partner of, friend of somebody at Whistle. Like if we played that, that's 7 degrees of separation at Whistle, it's probably about 1 degree between any person here. But what that's created is like this really unique culture because, well, firstly, you're working with like people that you really like. And generally speaking, like if you and I are friends, then a third person that you're friends with is probably going to be somebody that I could be friends with because we have similarities. So what it's created at Whistle is like an element of like it's like an interesting culture dynamic. Like for us, we joke around a lot internally, but we're very serious about our work. We don't take ourselves seriously. So like our Slack channels are all like just, GIFs like 24/7 and just like memes and whatever. But when it's client facing, when it's like, time to go, everyone works super hard. So one dynamic is like this very fun environment. The other dynamic also is, and this is what I feel, is like when you're working for something that somebody you're related to or connected to also works for and also relies on to feed their family, it creates a feeling of ownership that you wouldn't have if you only know these people from work. So I think with us, 130 people, with most people knowing each other, like somehow, the very, very personal relationship, I think it does create this like ownership culture, which is so important. Again, one is a remote company, but in general, like as a company that wants to succeed, no one, we would say this often to everyone we hired and would have the same line, which is like, hey, I stopped being a babysitter at like 14, like, whatever it was, 15. I'm not babysitting anyone. So like, if you're coming here and you need to be micromanaged, not a good place for you. Go somewhere where you want to be micromanaged. We don't want to micromanage you. We can see what you're doing, but we need people that can own it. So those elements of like that personal culture are so, so important. And you can also pick that up pretty quick. You can look at how that person works in a day-to-day, in general, in their previous jobs. And you can also pick that up in interviews as well, and in the way they solve problems or look to solve problems. Even as like an example of the culture here, like my my Slack name, like I'll have my name, but it's got a link to my calendar and you can book a time with me. And I'll often have people that will book a time with me and like share like, hey, here's an idea I have to improve the business. Or here's something I see that's broken that we should fix or work on. And I love that. And I think people are like, I think people are really scared of that, pointing out to a CEO that something is not where it should be. But to me, that is like my favorite thing. That clip, I can't remember, I think it's Blood Diamond, where he says like, I don't want peace, I want problems always. That's like the mindset. It's hard to pick those people, but if you can find people who are like very trustworthy, who are very competent at the job and culturally aligned with like what you're trying to build, and you can go really far, much further than if you didn't have any of those three. So those would be my top three, I think.
That's a fascinating approach. And on the client side of things, because I know you said this has sort of changed from the formative, scrappy years where anyone that has a pulse and has a bit of money is going to pay you. You've got to take them in. So talk then a bit about like how that's changing your kind of selection criteria, how you qualify and disqualify potential good companies to work with.
Yeah. So we've learned, right, and we've learned in some ways the hard way. I think also part of it in the beginning, it's not just desperation, it's also ego, right? So there's the desperation side of like, oh my God, like we need money. And then there's the ego side of like, yeah, we'll make it work. Like we're, and then you learn where your limitations are. So for us, for example, we've got an assessment when we talk to a customer based on what they're looking at, which verticals they're in, um, and where we know we're stronger, where we know we're weaker. And basically, as we run through that, we've also got benchmark data that helps us build projections as to what success is likely to look like. And we believe a lot in transparency. So I often tell any prospect I speak to, like, um, I'm not trying to sell you anything that you don't need. But if you do need it, I'm going to try my hardest because I feel like it's an obligation that I should, provide you. If I really think that I can help you, then then I'm going to sell you, right? So um, we'll turn away companies all day long. If I look at even just companies that I speak to, it's probably like 40% of the companies I speak to in the first call and saying, hey, listen, it's not really a good fit. And even if they've come through a network or whatever, there's a way to let them down. So the first thing is like, can we actually do the job based on their expectations? And actually today, we've actually just built an internal app for that as well that our AEs can use, and they can basically put in all the criteria, and then they get a score. And based on the score, tells them what we should offer the client. So are they like a done for you client or just like a talent client? Or should we just, not take them at all, etc. Which I think is really important for the client and for us. I learned in the beginning that it's about managing expectations. So if I tell you I'm going to get X and I get X plus one, I look like a hero to you, right? If I told you it's going to get X plus one, I get X, you're not as happy, right? So I think that that's very, very important, and we assess that in practical ways. And then the second piece, coming back to that culture element, is I also learned that like even if a client on paper is a client you could help, if there's like just a mismatch in terms of the dynamic that you have with them, it's going to be so painful, So the sale actually only starts once they start working with you. It's not like you close the deal and now it's moving on to the next order. It's actually, no, now you're stuck with this person every day for years. So you really want to work with a team that like gets it and you can work with, and that you don't like tick it in the, in fact, we did build it in our app. We have like a question because it's an internal app, right? Like, is this person going to be easy to work with? And you like tick yes or no and it scores accordingly. But you can tell that in the conversations you have, in the way they deal with getting information in that sales conversation that maybe they don't want to hear, or objections from you, or the way you handle their objections. You can tell that pretty quickly. So yeah, those are the two things we look at. Like, one is, practically speaking, can we deliver based on historical evidence? And then the second is like, culturally speaking, like, do we want to work with this person every day? And if not, that's also fine to just say, hey, listen, I just think that we're maybe a bit misaligned in terms of what we're looking for and how we're going to work together. Like I've had clients that say things like, I want to have a daily call with you as the CEO, but I also want to pay like, the lowest. And I'm like, this is just not going to work. Like, this is, or just like things like that, right? Like, there's just dynamic things that come up in the conversations that were like red flags very quickly. You just say like, you know what, hold on, let's maybe pump the brakes here, and I suggest you find somebody else to work with as well.
And wrapping up as we're kind of coming up on time, what's the number one mistake, double barrel question, what's the number one mistake you see businesses making when they're considering, starting outbound? And I guess from that, what's the kind of greatest piece of advice you'd give to businesses that are maybe, they've relied on inbound for now and have turned their attention to outbound?
So I think outbound is, if you go to social media, the focus for outbound is on the 1% of the problem, which is the what to say. So like, here's the ultimate, email template. Here's the ultimate calling script. Here's the ultimate personalized message. That is a 1% problem. The 99% problem that isn't as interesting, though Clay has actually made this more interesting, is like, how do I connect to somebody who matches my ICP, my ideal customer profile, on a channel that they're active on? If I can solve that, most people understand how to solve the 1% problem from there, right? So, and often like people overcook it. So let's look at an email template, for example, right? People are like, let's personalize it. Let's look at the latest earnings report, and then align all these pieces. It's not always. Sometimes less is more. It's often if you can just touch on one or two key things that somebody in that position at that company cares about, you're going to get through. But your email has to get delivered. Your email has to make it through the inbox. Your phone call needs to be answered. Your LinkedIn connection request needs to go through. There's only 3 channels. And so people focus a lot on message optimization, when actually you should focus on channel optimization and the underlying contact data quality that undermines that. If you can have the best, it's like, the whole thing with the tree falling in the woods and no one hears it, right? It's the exact same thing. If you write the ultimate personalized phone script, but you connect to no people today, is it worth it? Does it count? And it doesn't. So I think for anyone focusing on outbound, spend most of your time on the sharpening the axe, right? Of getting a really good list, a tight list, and a few key things that are worth bringing up when you connect with them. And then the 1% of your time trying to chop down the tree. With the okay, let me tweak the way I do this opener, or the way I ask this question, or how I deal with this objection. Those things are really interesting on social media, but they barely move the needle when you're looking at the volume that's required to get a meaningful result from out.
So it sounds like, and wrapping up and kind of summarizing, a common theme of this kind of podcast really has been people kind of seem to be focusing on the wrong things, whether it's the Silicon Valley success or the kind of the VC success stories and these huge multi-million, $billion, pound, whatever exits, or focusing on this 1% sort of hack the email script and all these damn gurus on LinkedIn and whatever else they are. The people are actually focusing on the wrong things. They need to be focusing more on that kind of unglamorous, unsexy work that's really going to move the business forward.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts from you, David? I mean, I've loved having you on the podcast, and I've learned so much from your story. Any kind of final thoughts you wanted to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, I mean, just to that point, Yona, our CEO, had a great saying he came up with the other day, which is, there is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but there is the rainbow. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. I think especially I think our generation, I don't know why, but culturally we were brought into this world of chase that number or hit that goal and then, and then, and then. And actually, I know it's very cheesy to share, but and it does tie into everything. The journey is what makes it, that is the fun, that is the destination, that is what makes it so engaging and so fun to be in a business. And to build a business. And if you're not loving that journey, and that goes also even for building outbound, right? If the building a list and really optimizing on those things don't interest you, then you're just not going to appreciate the whole experience of getting a meeting or building a successful business or building a great team. You really do need to be in a position, and that applies to business owners as well as employees, that you get some meaning out of the day-to-day that you're doing. And yes, absolutely, you should get paid handsomely for it and make tons of money. But it's so much more fun making money and enjoying what you're doing than making money and not enjoying what you're doing. Yeah, so I think that's my little tip. There is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but there is the rainbow.
Optimize the right things.
So thank you, David. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, David. Been an absolute pleasure.